happening right now. Phillips 66 says it's shutting off the gas and shutting down its Wilmington refinery.
Before you fill your tank again, you need to hear what Phillips 66 just triggered. The refinery shutdown hits at the worst possible moment. Demand is rising. Backup supply is shrinking. California, already isolated, now faces record import dependency. And the rest of the country is about to inherit the fallout through higher transportation costs, supply delays, and the sharpest price spikes in years. How fast will this crisis travel beyond California? Why are fuel analysts warning of a 2026 price ceiling no one is ready for? And who stands to lose the most when panic buying begins? The day California lost 139,000 barrels. The moment Phillips 66 confirmed its Los Angeles refinery shutdown, California felt the ground shift beneath it. The announcement did not arrive with warning, negotiation, or time to prepare. It landed like a hammer, instantly removing 139,000 barrels per day from the state's already fragile gasoline supply. Workers learned the truth through a rushed internal notice, watching decades of routine collapse in a single morning. Some stared at the refinery towers as if they were watching a familiar landmark fade from the skyline. Others called home immediately, their voices shaking as they tried to explain what this meant for the future. Families gathered that night around kitchen tables, absorbing the shock with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Parents wondered whether they could keep up with rising costs. Businesses anticipated thinner margins and higher transportation expenses. Workers who spent half their lives inside the refinery suddenly questioned where their skills fit. In an economy turning unpredictable and unforgiving, the emotional weight spread faster than the news itself. People sensed that this shutdown was not just a corporate decision. It was the spark of a statewide crisis that would reach every household, every commute, and every mile driven. As word spread, panic began to simmer. If one refinery could vanish overnight, what else could fall next? Californians felt as though the stability of their fuel supply had been pulled out from under them. The shutdown marked the end of certainty and the beginning of a storm no one was ready for. But the real panic erupted when people realized just how impossible it was for California to replace what it had just lost. The fuel island no one wants to live on. California had always been labeled a fuel island, but after the Phillips 66 shutdown, the phrase suddenly became terrifyingly literal. The state had zero interstate pipelines feeding it, zero secondary supply routes to rely upon, and zero practical tools to absorb a loss of this size. Every gallon burned inside its borders had to be produced within the state or carried across the ocean. There was no emergency valve, no hidden reserve, no quick workaround waiting to be activated. For the first time, everyday drivers confronted the gravity of that isolation. Gasoline could not simply be redirected from Texas or from the Gulf Coast. Nothing could be sent by pipeline because no such pipeline existed. California stood on its own, cut off from the national fuel grid that protected most other states from catastrophic price shocks. The shutdown turned what had once been a technical footnote into a life-altering reality. People suddenly understood that their gasoline prices would no longer be shaped solely by local events, but by global shipping schedules, ocean storms, refinery accidents abroad, and geopolitical tension thousands of miles away. The public realized something else too. Losing Phillips 66 meant losing the stability that had allowed the state to function despite its isolation. Now, California was exposed, vulnerable, and dependent on forces far outside its control. And that vulnerability became even more frightening once Californians learned how far their gasoline now had to travel. Before we move on, make sure you like this video, subscribe so you never miss updates, and share your thoughts in the comment below. 40 days at sea. Once the Phillips 66 shutdown forced California to rely more heavily on foreign gasoline. The timeline behind every gallon stretched into something surreal. Tankers departing from Asia required 30 to 40 days to reach the West Coast, and even a minor disruption could add weeks. People filled their tanks in February with gasoline loaded onto a ship in December. The product in their cars was no longer local or regional. It was global, slow, and fragile. Each tanker burned heavy fuel oil throughout its journey, layering environmental cost atop financial cost. Port congestion increased delays, and strict regulations complicated scheduling even further. Meanwhile, the Jones Act restricted movement between American ports, preventing California from easily accessing fuel from other domestic regions. Every additional mile traveled by tanker meant additional dollars added at the pump, and Californians could do nothing but wait, watching the calendar, watching the news, and hoping nothing disrupted the ocean lifeline keeping their state running. Gasoline was no longer something Californians could take for granted. It had become a long-distance commodity whose price reflected storms, shipping lanes, and global competition. The shutdown transformed every fill-up into a reminder of how far their fuel had traveled and how dependent they had become on that journey. Yet even if tankers arrived perfectly on time, California still faced an obstacle built into the fuel itself, the blend only a few can make. California's crisis did not end with long shipping routes or delayed tankers. The state required a specialized gasoline blend known as carbob, a formulation designed to meet strict environmental standards. Phillips 66 had been one of the few refineries capable of producing this blend consistently, and its shutdown removed a critical piece from a system already stretched to its limits. Most refineries around the world could not make carbob, even if they wanted to. The blend required advanced equipment, precise chemistry, and rigorous controls that only select facilities in South Korea, India, and a few other regions possessed. Those refineries already served their own markets, meaning California had to compete for limited production slots. And every gallon shipped had to pass strict quality checks before entering the state's distribution system. The shutdown exposed a bottleneck far more serious than anyone understood. California was not just short on gasoline. It was short on gasoline that met its own mandatory formulation. A single delay in a foreign refinery, a single quality control issue, or a single production interruption anywhere across the globe could choke supply further and send prices rocketing beyond anything Californians had ever experienced. Phillips 66 had not simply closed a refinery. It had triggered a cascade that reached into the chemistry of the state's fuel itself. And as Californians would soon discover, this was only the beginning of a crisis set to define the year ahead: the domino effect. The shutdown of Phillips 66 might have been the first blow, but it certainly was not the last. When Valero confirmed that its Benicia refinery would also halt operations, Californians realized the problem was not isolated. It was systemic. In less than 6 months, nearly 1/5 of the state's refining capacity would vanish, leaving supply thinner than at any point in recent memory. Industry analysts, who had warned about long-term contraction, now sounded almost prophetic, pointing to decades of tightening regulations, shrinking margins, and aging operations that had slowly pushed refineries toward the brink. Residents who had barely processed the first closure found themselves confronting a second shock. The Benicia facility had long served as a crucial link in the northern half of the state, and its absence meant fewer buffers when unexpected disruptions emerged. Every refinery that closed deepened the fragility of a system already strained by limited infrastructure and growing demand for specialized fuel. Californians began to understand that the shutdowns were not temporary inconveniences, but permanent shifts reshaping the energy landscape. Communities that had relied on these facilities for generations now faced an unsettling truth. Once a refinery goes dark, it rarely returns. Its absence becomes a permanent gap, forcing the rest of the system to stretch beyond design. With Phillips 66 and Valero both stepping away, California entered a new era defined by scarcity rather than surplus. But the real chaos began when markets tried to make sense of the sudden collapse in capacity, when markets panic. Market behavior often reveals what people fear before they are willing to admit it, and the fear surrounding California's shrinking fuel output surfaced immediately. Wholesale rack prices began swinging wildly, climbing or plunging within hours. Distributors described the experience as trying to make decisions inside a storm, where visibility vanished and instinct replaced strategy. A single rumor about delayed shipments or tightening inventories could send prices soaring, only to retreat when traders recalibrated their assumptions. Speculation magnified every whisper. Traders operating on thin data interpreted minor disruptions as early warnings of larger shortages, injecting volatility into a market already stretched by the loss of refinery output. Small distributors struggled to navigate the turbulence, watching their cost structures shift faster than they could update contracts. Larger companies attempted to hedge their exposure, But even they found the pace of change unnerving. Retailers, caught at the end of the chain, experienced a different kind of pressure. They faced rising acquisition costs without clear signals about when or whether the market would stabilize. Some chose to absorb temporary losses, hoping for calm, while others adjusted prices quickly to stay afloat. Every decision carried risk, and every miscalculation threatened operational viability. The market had entered a phase where logic bent beneath uncertainty, creating a climate defined by adrenaline and unease rather than predictability. And as markets convulsed, the political world saw both a crisis and an opportunity. Governors, Congress, and the energy war. No economic shock unfolds without political consequences, and California's refinery collapse ignited a fierce battle that stretched from the governor's office to the halls of Congress. Leaders across the spectrum reacted swiftly, each attempting to frame the crisis in ways that aligned with their agendas. Some pointed directly at environmental policies, claiming that years of aggressive regulation had backed refiners into a corner. Others argued that the shutdowns reflected deeper structural weaknesses in national energy planning, insisting the state had been left unsupported by broader federal strategy. Hearings began almost immediately. Legislators demanded briefings, agencies prepared reports, and committees sought answers to questions that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Why had no contingency plan been developed for refinery attrition? How had the state reached a point where a pair of closures could reshape energy security so dramatically? The debates grew heated as competing visions for the nation's energy future collided. Environmental advocates defended California's trajectory toward cleaner fuels, while opponents warned that policy ambitions had outpaced practical infrastructure. Governors from neighboring states weighed in as well, wary of the possibility that California's instability might spill beyond its borders. They urged federal intervention to stabilize regional supply before further disruptions occurred. The crisis had become more than a local issue. It had transformed into a national referendum on energy priorities, revealing ideological fractures that had long been widening. The rhetoric intensified as policymakers sought solutions, each insisting their path would steer the country away from deeper turmoil. Yet, beneath the speeches and hearings, a quieter truth emerged. Politics could not mend the fractures already spreading through communities affected by the closures. And at the heart of those fractures lay the people whose lives had been abruptly reshaped. 900 families, and a vanishing community. While politicians debated and markets convulsed, the human cost of the shutdowns deepened. Entire neighborhoods felt the shock as hundreds of workers grappled with the sudden loss of careers they had expected to last a lifetime. Refineries were more than industrial sites. They were anchors that sustained families, supported small businesses, and shaped local identity. Without them, communities faced a void that no policy announcement could immediately fill. Unions responded with anger and urgency, rallying members who feared the erosion of their livelihoods. Meetings grew crowded as families gathered to share information, seek assistance, and confront an uncertain future. Many workers had spent their entire adult lives at these facilities, mastering specialized roles that offered stability and skill-based pride. The closures dismantled that foundation in a moment, leaving workers unsure of where their expertise might find new purpose. Local businesses felt the blow just as sharply. Shops that had depended on refinery employees saw foot traffic falter. Restaurants that once filled during shift changes now served half-empty rooms. The economic ecosystem woven around the refineries began to fray, revealing how dependent the community had been on a single industrial heartbeat. Residents described the change as watching the center of their world quietly erode. For many, the emotional toll became the heaviest burden. The closure did not simply threaten income. It threatened identity, belonging, and the sense of continuity that had defined their lives. The community now faced a future without the institution that had shaped it for generations. And as the human consequences deepened, the crisis widened into something even larger, reshaping the path ahead. Energy independence was always a myth. For years, Americans were told a comforting story about energy independence, a narrative suggesting the nation could stand alone regardless of international volatility. Yet the truth, long buried beneath political slogans, has resurfaced with brutal clarity. The closures in California did more than disrupt local operations. They exposed how deeply the United States relies on oil imported from distant and often unstable regions. A significant share of the crude reaching American shores originates in Iraq, Ecuador, and Saudi Arabia, nations whose internal and regional tensions frequently spill into global markets. These ties bind the country to geopolitical landscapes far beyond its control. Every tanker arriving from the Middle East or South America carries more than fuel. It carries the weight of diplomatic negotiations, shifting alliances, and fragile agreements that can unravel without warning. When unrest flares or production dips abroad, the shock ripples instantly into American life, revealing how fragile independence truly is. Californians watching refinery closures may feel the impact most immediately, but the national implications stretch far wider. This moment forces a deep reflection on what independence actually means. Energy security is not simply a matter of extracting oil domestically. It requires stable partners abroad, resilient logistics, and the capacity to withstand global turbulence. Without these elements, independence becomes an illusion, and while foreign dependence shapes the nation's vulnerabilities, another debate is emerging at home, one that pits aspiration against reality. The EV dream versus the fossil fuel reality. The push toward electric vehicles has long been framed as America's next great transformation, a clean and visionary departure from fossil fuel dependence. Yet, the aspirational glow surrounding this transition often masks the gaps that still define it. Despite steady growth, nationwide adoption remains far below levels needed to meaningfully reduce gasoline demand. Millions of drivers still rely on combustion engines, and the pace of replacement is slower than many policymakers anticipated. Charging infrastructure, while expanding, is unevenly distributed, leaving large regions without reliable access to fast or consistent charging options. The limitations become clear when examining daily life. Drivers commuting long distances cannot depend solely on chargers that may be spaced too far apart or strained by local demand. Apartment dwellers lack consistent access to home charging, limiting their ability to participate in the transition. Long-haul travelers see inconsistent networks across state borders, revealing gaps that remain unresolved despite ambitious timelines. These challenges do not dismiss the promise of electric vehicles, but demonstrate the disconnect between policy aspirations and present-day realities. Meanwhile, gasoline demand persists because millions of vehicles already on the road will remain there for years. The nation still depends on refineries to meet this ongoing need, even as refinery capacity contracts. This tension between the future people envision and the infrastructure that exists defines America's energy crossroads. And as competing visions collide, new proposals are emerging, each attempting to fill the void left by a shrinking refinery network. If you want to stay ahead of what happens next, subscribe now. The developments coming in 2026 will affect every driver in the country, and our next report exposes changes already unfolding behind the scenes that you deserve to understand clearly. Radical solutions. The closures forced Californians to confront a question rarely asked in public. How does a state replace refining capacity that disappears almost overnight? One proposal gaining attention involves converting dormant refineries into massive storage hubs, capable of holding imported fuel for extended periods. Supporters argue such facilities could stabilize supply, offering a buffer when deliveries were delayed or disrupted. Yet the idea carries steep trade-offs, including limited job creation, environmental uncertainties, and community fears about constant tanker activity. Another possibility involves expanding storage capacity across multiple coastal sites, allowing the state to accumulate larger reserves. Critics caution that such expansions may conflict with local land use restrictions and generate strong opposition from residents wary of increased industrial presence. Building entirely new refineries, while theoretically feasible, faces even stronger pushback. Modern facilities require significant investment, complex permitting processes, and long construction timelines, making them unlikely solutions in the short term. Communities surrounding existing industrial zones express mixed reactions. Some welcome the prospect of new economic anchors, while others fear the environmental consequences of repurposed or expanded fuel infrastructure. Every option introduces a new set of questions, none of them easily answered, highlighting the uncertainty now shaping California's energy planning. Yet, while California weighs its choices, the global market is already moving, and new power centers are emerging far beyond American shores. Asia steps in. As California confronts its shrinking refinery network, nations across Asia are seizing the moment to expand their influence in global fuel markets. South Korea has positioned itself as a dominant supplier, leveraging modern facilities and efficient export channels to meet rising international demand. India, too, has increased its output, capitalizing on newer refineries capable of producing specialized blends sought by foreign buyers. These nations recognize the strategic advantage in supplying fuel to regions facing refinery attrition, and they are moving decisively to fill the gap. OPEC's coordinated production decisions reshape global supply, tightening or loosening availability and redirecting trade routes overnight. American states dependent on imports must navigate priorities set far beyond their borders, with every foreign shift affecting drivers at home. As Asian refining capacity expands and United States capacity contracts, power tilts toward large-scale producers abroad, underscoring how deeply California's energy security now rests in the hands of distant nations. And with global forces now steering the market, the consequences for everyday Americans are growing clearer with each passing month. Chevron, Shell, and the corporate chessboard. The energy crisis sparked by California's refinery shutdowns did not leave major corporations idle. Chevron, Shell, and other industry giants began repositioning themselves almost immediately, analyzing the disruptions not only as threats, but as potential openings. Some companies initiated strategic retreats from regions where refining had become too expensive or politically constrained, choosing instead to shift capital toward markets with more predictable regulatory environments. Others explored selective expansions, targeting areas where declining competition created opportunities for increased market influence. Corporate strategists explored every option, from investing in advanced refining technology to forming partnerships that spread risk or strengthening downstream operations to retain value as output declined. These choices shaped global positions, not just local responses. Competitive tension intensified as companies anticipated rivals' moves, revealing shifting priorities. Though unseen by most Californians, these decisions would determine future fuel flows, investment patterns, and overall system resilience across the coming years. And as companies recalibrated their strategies, the broader economy braced for the next shockwave building beneath the surface. The economic shock you'll feel everywhere. The decline in refining capacity did more than disrupt California's energy landscape. It triggered economic currents that began flowing across the nation. Freight companies encountered rising fuel expenses that fed directly into transportation costs. Every delivery, from produce shipments to industrial materials, became more expensive to move. Those increases rippled through supply chains, nudging prices upward long before goods reached store shelves. Food distributors operating on tight margins adjusted their pricing structures to remain viable, adding costs that consumers would confront in countless, small but accumulating ways. Manufacturers felt the strain as rising fuel costs reshaped production budgets, forcing shifts in output schedules, distribution networks, and even product lines. These adjustments created regional disparities driven by transportation economics rather than demand. Retailers, squeezed between supplier increases and customer expectations, watched profitability erode. Persistent fuel instability produced steady inflationary pressure, embedding higher prices into the economy in ways difficult to reverse. Yet rising prices were only one part of the story, because workers across the nation were preparing to confront the crisis head-on. The labor revolt and America's 2026 political earthquake. The refinery closures ignited a wave of frustration that quickly transformed into organized labor action. Workers across multiple states viewed the shutdowns as part of a broader pattern in which industrial communities were left behind, and they began mobilizing with renewed determination. Protests grew outside shuttered facilities, where displaced employees demanded accountability and transparency. Unions orchestrated coordinated demonstrations that drew national attention, framing the crisis as a stark example of how economic shifts could devastate working families without adequate safeguards or planning. As tensions escalated, the movement expanded beyond refinery workers. Truck drivers, warehouse employees, and others whose livelihoods depended on reliable fuel supplies joined the cause, arguing that the crisis affected everyone, interconnected within the energy ecosystem. Their message resonated with voters frustrated by shrinking job security and rising economic uncertainty. These sentiments intensified as the year approached critical political milestones, transforming labor grievances into powerful catalysts for nationwide debate. Candidates recognized the movement's growing power as energy security became a defining issue, with rival factions promoting sharply different national visions. Labor leaders urged support for candidates backing job protection and resilient infrastructure. The uprising signaled a broader shift in how Americans understood their connection to national energy policy today. And while political battles raged, everyday life for millions continued to evolve under the weight of rising fuel burdens. The new cost of being an American driver. For millions of Americans, the energy crisis reached its most personal form behind the wheel. Commuters who once budgeted confidently now found themselves reconsidering every trip, calculating whether errands could be combined or postponed. Annual driving costs rose steadily as fuel expenses absorbed a growing share of household budgets. Families who relied on long commutes faced difficult choices about employment, childcare, and daily routines. Lifestyle adjustments became common. Some residents shifted to carpooling or public transit, while others explored remote work arrangements to reduce travel altogether. Weekend road trips, once spontaneous, required deliberate planning. The financial strain stretched beyond fuel purchases, influencing decisions about vehicle maintenance, replacement, and overall mobility. Drivers navigating this new landscape felt a persistent tension between necessity and affordability. Rural communities suffered most as long distances and limited transit magnified rising fuel costs, turning every trip into financial strain. By 2026, mobility had become a daily sacrifice, reshaping routines and expectations. Each mile carried a question that refused to fade. How long could this reality last? This story is still unfolding, and what happens next will affect every driver, every household, and every mile traveled across this country. If this breakdown changed the way you see what's coming, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I read everyone. Make sure you like this video if you want more deep dives like this, and subscribe so you don't miss what's already lining up for 2026.